The film opens in Messina, one of the richest islands in Sicily back in the 1902. In the year 1908, a mysterious woman is shown traveling through the narrow paths of the woods in Messina. The carriage stops outside her villa and the woman comes out clothed in all black. Upon taking her seat inside her villa, one of her housekeepers appears in front of her with a girl, accusing her son of the blade. The woman summons and asks his son, Peter Hoffman, if he has hurt the girl. The moment Peter declares the girl a liar, his mother tells the housekeeper to escort the lady off her property. When the girl is taken out, Peter's mother asks him to give back the razor blade, but Peter bluntly denies it, saying the blade is his father's last gift. After this, Peter goes outside his villa and sets an innocent cage for his amusement. Then, a boy named Alfredo approaches Peter with his younger brother Nicole, who's carrying a crate with their lifeless dog inside it. He tries to attack Peter while accusing him of murdering his dog. However, Peter gets rid of Alfredo by saying that his mother will get him and his entire family cast off from Messina if he ever tries to lay his hands on him. After hearing this, Alfredo and his brother walk away and leave Peter alone. That night, Alfredo experiences a disturbing nightmare about his pet dog, which not only wakes Alfredo up, but weaves a sinister idea in his head. The same night, Alfredo goes outside Hoffman's villa while covering his face with a sack. Peter casually looks out of the window and sees Alfredo standing outside in the rain. He walks out and mocks Alfredo for the way he's trying to mess with him. In search of Alfredo, Peter comes across a wooden tombstone, on which Alfredo has carved Peter's epitaph in a poetic style. Suddenly, Alfredo shows up behind him with a shovel. He strikes Peter's head and knocks him out. After some time, Peter wakes up inside a nailed crate box with no way out. Putting an end to his horrible experiments and brutality, he is left to rot in the crate for eternity. The scene cuts to the present time in London, where the story revolves around an archaeologist named Norman Nash and his daughter Liz. After a hectic day at work, Norman goes home to his deaf daughter. Inside his house, the walls are covered with the photo frames of his departed wife, a tragedy in itself. Since Liz isn't around, Norman searches her room and finds a spirit summoning guidebook from underneath her bed. In the meantime, Liz shows up and tells him to leave. She is a hopeless young girl who wants to contact her mother from the spirit world, but her efforts had never worked out for her. In the next scene, Norman goes fishing with his boss. As they are waiting to catch fish, Norman confesses to him that he's worried about his daughter becoming distant from him. Upon hearing this, his boss blames him for his daughter's distress and suggests moving to another town to lighten up and reconnect with each other. The old man talks Norman into moving to Messina, in Sicily, and offers him a way to get a new job there. He also confesses that Messina has a school for deaf kids, which will be perfect for Liz. Now, without giving it a serious thought, Norman moves to Messina as he is desperate to rebuild his bond with his daughter. Upon reaching the place, he is welcomed by one of his workmates named Bianca. She takes them to an old British cemetery, which had been completely wrecked after the historic earthquake that devastated Messina. Liz takes a stroll and explores the cemetery on her own. Bianca then takes them to their new home and shows them the outside area that has bird cages. The house has a short passageway that leads into the woods. It is also a shortcut to Liz's school. Later, Bianca helps Norman unpack some groceries and humbly invites him over to her home for dinner. However, Norman hesitantly says that Liz is a vegan and demands different kinds of food. After hearing this, Bianca assures him that her aunt can cook all sorts of food, so he should not worry about it. The next day at school, Liz confidently walks past other deaf students while waving at them. Meanwhile, Bianca and Norman visit the cemetery and continue their job, which is to take care of and preserve the cemetery. They find Peter Hoffman's tomb and go through his belongings. They see his tombstone, on which Alfredo had described the devious Peter. In the belongings, Norman sees a razor blade and other items that are generally used to set someone on fire. Bianca shares that such belongings were put in the grave so the child could play with his toys in the afterlife. That night, Liz uses the guidebook to draw random symbols on a bishop's sphere and initiates a new method of communicating with the spirit world. Liz dims the light and places a torch in front of the sphere. Then, she puts her mother's photo frame beside it and writes down a question in her notebook, asking if anyone is present with her. When she spins the sphere, the symbols reflect on the front wall and create different alphabets and shapes. Meanwhile, Norman takes a look at Peter's tombstone that he has brought home. Now, due to the presence of the tombstone at home, a mysterious thing happens in Liz's room while she's asleep. The bishop sphere spins on its own, and the symbols make up the word yes on the wall, which is an answer to Liz's previous question. The next morning, Liz explores nature instead of going back home. While wandering around, she elopes in the woods and ends up near Hoffman's rusty old villa. Nearby, she sees an old housekeeping lady whose throat has been and she's asking for help on a ritual bed. Along with the lady, a dark past of Peter is flashed, where his mother has held him against her chest and his father's throat has been slit open. A person is performing a ritual in which they have slaughtered an owl and the housekeeping lady. Liz becomes scared, and as she's about to run away, the horrible flashes go away and a British lady shows up out of nowhere. Norman also arrives, allowing the woman to introduce herself. She goes by the name Harriet. She lives nearby and walks through the woods often. The following night, Norman looks up Peter's family online and finds out that his father used to be one of the wealthiest and influential men of Messina in the 1900s. However, under unknown circumstances, he took his Meanwhile, Liz spins the bishop's sphere in her room and repeats her question on the notepad. This time, she gets the answer yes immediately. She becomes excited and writes down another question, asking who the entity could be. The symbols reflect the word mum. All of a sudden, strong wind bursts through Liz's room window. She goes near the windows and notices a moving shadow in the garden. She runs outside and glances at the shadow, which turns out to be Peter's mother, Mrs. Hoffman. She runs after her but falls on the ground, leaving her to watch the woman disappear into the bushes. The next morning, Norman is accompanied by Bianca on his way to the cemetery. He shows her an old newspaper, in which Peter and his father's unresolved mystery was published. He discusses that the 12-year-old Peter disappeared a year after his father took. 3 days after Peter's disappearance, the island was stricken with an earthquake that destroyed everything. Upon reaching Peter's tomb, they find it destroyed with a lifeless bird on top of it. Norman asks Bianca to get the cameras fixed so they can keep a watch on the cemetery. Agreeing to Norman, Bianca walks forward. Meanwhile, Norman sees an old woman who disappears in front of him, but he chooses to ignore it. The following evening, Norman takes Liz to Bianca's place for dinner. Bianca's old aunt, Emma, hands a small belonging to Norman, explaining it's sprayed with holy water and it prevents the evil spirits from harming the person who owns it. The father-daughter duo comes back home at night and dives into their separate activities. Liz experiments with the bishop's sphere once again. She writes something down, asking if her mother is present with her, and spins the sphere. The symbols on the sphere make up the word no on the wall. Then, she hears some wet noises coming from the corner of her room. When she goes near the wall, the lurking ghost of the housekeeping lady haunts her. She quickly turns on the lights and the ghost disappears. That night, she shows her father the bishop's sphere and claims that she has made contact with her mother, but Norman scolds her for playing with toys and making up lies about contacting her mother. The next morning, Norman invites Bianca over to her place while Liz is at school. At school, Liz goes to the bathroom to wash her hands, and she gets startled by the dirty wash basin. What she doesn't know is that behind her stands the rotten flesh of the housekeeping lady, who then takes possession of her body. When Liz opens the tap to wash her hands, the wash basin fills up with black gunk, and a pair of hands, covered in black slime, grabs Liz's wrists with a firm grip. Liz starts crying in fear and falls back in an attempt to free her wrists. Her wrists become bruised, so she rolls down the sleeves to prevent suspicions. Meanwhile, Norman has Bianca look over his dirty pile of work in his workroom. He confesses that Peter's belongings box has gone missing, so Bianca assumes it must be under the piles of paperwork. Norman gets frustrated and raises his voice at Bianca, but he immediately apologizes for his behavior. He later takes her out to a bar to open up about his life. Upon asking, Norman reveals that his wife was his partner at his job 5 years ago. The two were digging in Turkey, and during their excavation, they came across a Roman sarcophagus that was in great condition. Norman was too excited about the discovery, so he sent his wife home with Liz and stayed at job to brush off the dirt from the sarcophagus. However, a truck hit his wife's car and knocked it off the bridge. His wife passed away on the spot, while Liz lost her sense of hearing. After hearing his story, Bianca sympathizes with him and agrees that he's done the right thing by coming to Messina for a fresh start. Meanwhile, Liz wakes up to a voice that's repeatedly telling her to go away. That voice happens to be Peter's. Liz goes near the windows and takes a look outside. She is petrified to see the housekeeping lady, with blood coming out of her sleeve. All of a sudden, Liz gets pushed by the wind, making her stick to the wall. As she's unable to move, Peter's evil spirit crawls on the wall and gets on top of poor Liz. Meanwhile, Norman comes back to his office room and watches the CCTV footage to see where the box disappeared. As he's fully invested in the footage, a bloodied hand with sharp claws comes up on his screen, giving Norman a scare. Then, Liz suddenly shows up with a change in her demeanor. She asks her father to pick her up early from school tomorrow. Then, Liz shows some affection by kissing his father on the cheek before leaving. The next morning, Norman wakes up to Liz making bacon and eggs for breakfast. Norman is beyond shocked to see Liz cooking bacon because she's a vegan and hasn't touched meat in years. When he confronts Liz about this, she claims that she's made breakfast for him. Norman gets paranoid and raises his voice at Liz because he knows his real daughter will never go anywhere near meat. After this, Liz gets upset, so she cusses while talking to her father and throws the food on the ground. Norman shouts at her, admitting that he's trying hard to connect with her after her mother's loss, but instead of reciprocating, she's driving him insane. Because of this, Liz becomes heartbroken and leaves. Following the fight with Liz, Norman goes to the cemetery and continues his work on the tombs that are outside the area. While he is working, he is greeted by Lieutenant Calarco, a member of the Italian paramilitary police. Norman is relieved to see him and reports that there has been tomb damage and a possible instance of theft, so Calarco must give this case his time. After some observation, Calarco tells him to forget about the cemetery and that he should leave this place immediately. Suddenly, Norman notices the same woman he saw on his first day. He tries to talk to the woman, but she continues walking in the cemetery's building direction. Norman looks back and finds Calarco leaving, so he decides to go after the strange woman. He goes inside the damaged and abandoned cemetery and hears footsteps running in a specific direction. He follows the sound of the footsteps and comes across a broken tomb. When he reaches near, he finds Peter's belongings box inside the grave. Baffled by the revelation, Norman takes a minute to process this and then leans forward to pick up the box. Suddenly, a very strong set of hands grabs Norman's arm while he's picking the box from inside the tomb. Norman screams and frees his arm from the strong grip, but the sharp claws injure his entire arm. Norman takes the box and runs back home to seek Bianca's help in aiding his injured arm. While she dresses his wounds, he goes through the belongings box and finds a picture of the Hoffman villa. He finds it strange and claims that the picture wasn't in the belongings before. After getting his wounds dressed, he goes to pick up Liz from her school. However, the guard informs him he is 3 hours late, so Liz left on her own. He runs into the woods to find his daughter, and becomes astonished to see Liz being playfully chased by Harriet. When Harriet sees Norman, she stops and apologizes. Norman invites her over and appreciates that Liz has bonded with her. However, Norman doesn't realize that he doesn't see Harriet anywhere other than the woods. He opens up a little about being a bad father, but Harriet rebuts him, encouraging him to stop hurting himself that way. Before leaving, she looks at Liz with her enchanting eyes, and the girl can't help but stare right back. That day, Norman uses the map to find the location of Hoffman's villa and decides to visit it personally. By following the rock-hard bird cadavers that are stuck in the dried branches and roots of the trees, Norman finally locates the Hoffman villa. Norman breaks in and takes a good look around. Near the staircase, he sees a portrait of Peter and his father, Edward. Suddenly, Norman feels the presence of another entity closer to him. When he looks to his side, he sees Mrs. Hoffman walking straight toward him in aggression. Fearful, runs out of the villa immediately. At the exit door, he is stopped by an old man who's pointing his gun at Norman. The old man takes him back to his place and reveals himself as the caretaker of the abandoned villa. While pouring Norman a drink, he shows him a picture of his father and uncle. His father turns out to be Nicole, and his uncle, Alfredo. The old man reveals that his father lost his arm in the earthquake back in 1908, whereas his uncle Alfredo lost his life. Norman is intrigued and wants to know more about the old man's ancestors, so he asks if his father knew Peter Hoffman. The old man reveals that his father would often describe Peter as the most horrific and cruelest person of his time. He found amusement in living things, birds specifically. He would do the nastiest things without the fear of being punished, because of his mother's unconditional love for him. The old man also claims that his father was present at the villa when Peter cut his father's throat with his razor blade because he wanted his mother to himself only. She covered up the incident by claiming that her husband, Edward, had taken. But things became unbearable when Peter hurt an innocent woman and took Alfredo's. He reveals that one day, Alfredo abducted Peter and put him in a crate somewhere hidden. Nicole told Alfredo to free Peter since his mother was a powerful woman who could ruin their lives if she found out. However, Alfredo didn't listen to him, but their father overheard them talking. After this, Nicole told his father everything, and thus his father convinced him to set Peter free. Sadly, by the time Alfredo reached the hidden place to free Peter, the earthquake took place and destroyed the entire city. Due to this, Alfredo got buried under the concrete and lost his life while Nicole only lost his arm. Then, the old man unveils another mystery that was witnessed by his father. He reveals that days after the earthquake, Mrs. Hoffman was a housekeeping lady and performed a ritual to transfer her son's spirit within the housekeeper's corpse. On the same night, Mrs. Hoffman disappeared into the woods and was never seen again. People assume that she's a witch, and she will not stop until she finds her boy Peter. Later that night, Norman invites Bianca over to his place and announces that he's heading back to London with his daughter. This means Bianca must help him classify some of the work that they've done in the past few days. Bianca finds it disappointing, but she forgets about it when she sees a bishop sphere in Norman's hands. She sees the symbols drawn over it and starts panicking. Bianca reveals that her aunt is a preacher of God who knows a lot about the spirit world. Then, she claims that if Liz has used the sphere, she must have opened a secret doorway for the spirits to return to this world. Norman doesn't believe in any of it, but on Bianca's insistence, he allows her to take Liz back to her Aunt Emma. At Bianca's home, Emma notices cuts all over Liz's back and finds out that she's under the witch's spell. Meanwhile, Bianca talks to Norman on call and assures everything is fine. She then finishes up her work on the laptop and goes to the kitchen, where she finds Liz eating while sitting on the floor. After seeing Bianca, Liz runs away immediately. The woman then runs to her Aunt Emma, who's been hurt by the possessed Liz. As she tries to wake her aunt up, Liz shows up from behind and chokes Bianca. Bianca's feet get lifted off the ground and she struggles to breathe. Seeing this, Emma gets up and pins an item bathed with holy water on Liz's back. The spirit inside Liz's body starts experiencing pain, and she falls to the floor. Emma is quick to perform exorcism on Liz, but Norman shows up enraged and takes his daughter away. At home, Norman apologizes to his daughter and prepares to leave the next morning. That night, Mrs. Hoffman's ghost casts some spells outside Liz's window. This causes Peter's evil spirit to take over Liz's body. The lights start flickering all of a sudden, so Norman goes to check up on Liz. In the corridor, he sees a trail of bird corpses that lead all the way to Liz's room. Outside her room, Norman sees Peter's reflection instead of his daughter in the mirror. Baffled, he realizes that Emma and Bianca weren't lying. He tries to save his daughter, but Liz jumps off the balcony and flees with Mrs. Hoffman. Then, Norman goes after them, but Liz takes out a bird corpse from the tree and hands it to Mrs. Hoffman. She casts a voodoo spell and the bird. Norman gets squeezed the same way. She then throws away the bird, causing the same to happen to Norman. Then, Mrs. Hoffman takes Liz to the same spot where she performs rituals. She places Liz down on the bed and casts another spell that turns Liz into Peter. Meanwhile, Norman runs back to Bianca's house where she's dressing his back wounds. Emma suggests that they should perform an exorcism on Peter's corpse to get Liz back. Sadly, they don't know the whereabouts of Peter's body, because Alfredo had hidden it before the earthquake. Emma then convinces Norman to use the bishop's spear to contact Alfredo and find out where Peter's corpse is. Alone inside a room, Norman summons the spirit of Alfredo, who shows up from behind and grabs High's head in a haunting way. He screams into Norman's ears, penetrating his memories. Norman then revisits the day of the earthquake and finds Peter's body hidden inside the cemetery's church. When he comes out to tell Emma everything, their doorbell rings. Norman is surprised to see Harriet at the door. She requests to come inside, wanting to lead them to Liz, but Emma immediately shuts the door, claiming she's the witch. Harriet turns out to be Mrs. Hoffman, who starts screaming so loud, causing the house to crack. Then, Emma reads verses from the Bible, repelling the witch. Emma also reveals that witches need an invitation before they can come in contact with humans, so she strictly forbids letting anyone in. Then, she gives Bianca the holy water and tells her to perform exorcism in the cemetery while she stays at home. As Norman and Bianca drive away, Emma invites the witch over to her home to distract her. The witch takes Emma outside and decapitates her head from the body. Bianca watches this from the car and starts crying in fear. When they reach outside the cemetery, the doors are chained and a lifeless body falls on the front of their car, breaking their windshield. Norman drives the car and breaks the chain doors to get inside the cemetery. They know the witch cannot walk on the consecrated ground. They run inside the church and find the spot where Peter is buried. The holy water accidentally slips from Bianca's hands and falls into a pit of muddy water. She dirties her hands and finds the bottle of holy water. But by the time they dig Peter's grave and splash holy water over his skeleton, the witch shows up in her real form and she summons reanimated corpses. Hundreds of corpses grapple with Norman, but Bianca doesn't stop until the exorcism is done. Finally, the corpses turn into ashes and fade away, but the witch is determined to take revenge. She grabs Bianca by the hair and tries to slay her, but Norman attacks her with a metal rod, puncturing her chest. Bianca then finishes uttering the final verses from the Bible and ends her exorcism. Along with Peter's corpse, the witch burns too. Meanwhile, Norman and Bianca run into the woods and find Liz lying unconscious on the ritual bed. They take her home, knowing they've gotten rid of the evil spirits. After this, Norman changes his mind about going back to London and starts working at the cemetery. However, Lieutenant Calaraco shows up and warns Norman that he should run since he has united the witch with her son's corpse, which isn't a good sign. Then, Calaraco disappears near his tomb. This is when Norman realizes that Calaraco is an apparition. Meanwhile, at Liz's school, she hears the humming sounds of the witch and becomes possessed once again. Only this time, she finds herself trapped in the crate in Peter's spot, while he takes over her body permanently.